Dad, please do not call the police. I did not do anything. But he looked right through me, believed my sister's lies, and let the officers take me away in handcuffs. For 18 long months in a concrete cell, not a single family member came to see me. They thought they had buried me forever, so they could keep their perfect country club lives. They had no idea the day I finally walked free would be the exact day they lost absolutely everything. My name is Imani, and I am 33 years old. Today is my first day of freedom. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down the false image your family created just to find your own peace. The heavy double oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club stood before me, towering and immaculate. I stood on the pristine marble steps, breathing in the crisp evening air. It smelled entirely different from the recycled metallic air of the state correctional facility I had woken up in this morning. I looked down at what I was holding. In my left hand, I carried a cheap, clear plastic bag the prison had issued me upon release, containing nothing but my original shoelaces, a dead cell phone, and a transit card. Covering my body was a meticulously crafted, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit in midnight black. The contrast was sharp, intentional, and entirely unapologetic. I did not come here to blend in. I came to tear the house down. I raised my right foot and kicked the brass handles of the double oak doors with enough force to send them crashing violently against the interior walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the grand ballroom. Inside the scene was a nauseating display of stolen wealth and fabricated prestige. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceiling, casting a golden glow over towering floral arrangements of white orchids and imported roses. A string quartet had been playing softly in the corner, but the violent crash of the doors caused the cellist to drag his bow sharply across the strings, producing a harsh screech that brought the entire room to a dead halt. Every head turned toward the entrance. Hundreds of eyes belonging to the city elite, old money executives, church leaders, and social climbers locked onto me. They saw the midnight black suit. They saw the clear plastic prison bag. They saw a ghost they thought they had locked away forever. At the center of the ballroom stood the golden couple. Jada, my 31-year-old sister, was wearing a custom silk gown that probably cost more than the average car. She had her hair perfectly styled, projecting the ultimate image of black excellence, married into generational wealth. Beside her stood her husband Julian, a 35-year-old corporate finance executive whose patrician white features were currently twisted in confusion. They were right in the middle of a champagne toast celebrating their 5-year anniversary, a celebration funded entirely by the multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement they had pinned on me. Jada froze. Her perfectly manicured fingers went slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp, hitting the marble floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sound of the breaking glass broke the spell over the room. Whispers immediately erupted among the guests. I could see the church elders leaning in to gossip, their eyes wide with scandal. Jada did not wait for the whispers to grow louder. Her survival instinct kicked in, driven by her absolute obsession with high society status and country club optics. She gathered the heavy silk fabric of her gown and rushed across the ballroom floor, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. She reached me and immediately grabbed my arm, her grip digging into my tailored sleeve like eagle talons. Her face was arranged in a tight, forced smile for the benefit of the watching crowd, but her eyes were wild with panic and absolute fury. "You are supposed to be in a halfway house," Jada hissed under her breath, pulling me slightly to the side so Julian's elite partners would not hear. "What are you doing here, ruining my night? You need to turn around and walk right back out those doors." She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask how the last 18 months of my life had been while I slept on a thin mattress surrounded by concrete walls. Her only concern was the fragile illusion of perfection she had built her entire life around. Jada reached into her designer clutch with trembling fingers and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She shoved it aggressively against my chest. "Take this and get out before you embarrass us," she whispered, venom dripping from every word. "Go find a motel or a shelter. You are not ruining my 5-year anniversary in front of Julian's family and the entire congregation. Just disappear, Imani." I looked down at the crumpled bill against my lapel. I looked at the sister who had happily forged my digital signature on transfer documents 18 months ago, sending me to a federal facility so she could keep her lavish lifestyle. I did not flinch. I did not cry. The woman who used to cry and beg for her family's validation died the day she traded her business attire for an orange jumpsuit. I calmly reached up and took the $100 bill from her hand. I stepped past her, walking deliberately toward the spot where she had been standing moments before. I dropped the crisp bill directly into the puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal on the floor. I turned back to face her, my voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the front row of guests could hear every single word. I did not need your charity when Dad let the police drag me out of our living room in handcuffs, Jada. I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. I certainly do not need it now. The gasp that rippled through the front row of tables was audible. Jada's face drained of color, turning an ashen gray. She looked frantically back at Julian, silently pleading for him to fix this. Julian had seen enough. He was a man used to absolute control, relying heavily on his corporate title and the unearned confidence that came with his family money. He stormed over to the entrance, his face flushed red with indignation. He stepped in front of Jada, shielding her as if I were a physical threat. He looked at me with the exact same arrogance he had worn in the courtroom when he testified against me, with a perfectly straight face. "You have completely lost your mind coming here," Julian demanded, his voice booming across the silent room. "You are a convicted felon trespassing at a private event." I did not even wait for my response. He turned his attention to the two large security guards standing near the coat check. Julian snapped his fingers at them, a sharp, commanding sound echoing his sense of entitlement. "Security!" he shouted, pointing a rigid finger at me. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately. Throw her out on the street and call the police. Tell them we have a hostile trespasser." The two security guards stepped forward, their hands reaching toward their utility belts. They were large, imposing men hired to keep the uninvited out of this exclusive enclave. Jada crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk returning to her face as she anticipated my physical removal. She expected me to be dragged out kicking and screaming, just like the day they destroyed my life. I did not move a muscle. I simply looked at the two approaching guards and raised one single hand palm outward. The reaction was instantaneous. The moment the guards saw my raised hand, they stopped dead in their tracks. They did not just pause, they completely abandoned their aggressive posture. Both men took a synchronized step back, planted their feet, shoulder-width apart, and locked their arms respectfully behind their backs. They stood at absolute attention, staring straight ahead, completely ignoring Julian's orders. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. The silence was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. Julian stared at the guards, his face contorting in confusion. He snapped his fingers again, louder this time. "Did you not hear me?" he yelled, his voice cracking slightly with frustration. "I am a platinum member of this club. I said remove the felon right now." The guards remained completely statuesque, ignoring him as if he were nothing more than a ghost. Julian turned back to me, his arrogant composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of something he could not understand. He looked at the guards, then at me, his eyes darting back and forth. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "Why are they not moving? What did you do?" I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. I looked around the opulent ballroom, taking in the crystal, the flowers, the terrified faces of my family, and the absolute confusion of the wealthy elite. The 18 months of isolation, the cold nights, the terrible food, the absolute betrayal, it all culminated in this exact second. I looked right into Julian's panic-stricken eyes. The real party was just getting started. Julian stared at the two massive security guards. His face shifted from a mask of arrogant authority to complete and utter bewilderment. He expected them to lunge at me. He expected them to grab my arms and drag me out into the cold night air, just like the police had done a year and a half ago. Instead, the guards remained rooted to the polished marble floor. Their hands were clasped firmly behind their broad backs, and their eyes stared straight ahead, completely ignoring his frantic commands. I watched the gears grind and stall in Julian's head. His corporate privilege was short-circuiting right in front of my eyes, because someone in a uniform had finally refused to obey his command. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The heels of my suit clicked sharply against the floor. The sound cut through the suffocating silence of the grand ballroom like a gavel striking wood. I told him he seemed confused. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the words carry effortlessly over the dead quiet of the room. I explained that these gentlemen were doing exactly what they were paid to do, which was to protect the interests and the safety of the owner. Julian let out a harsh barking laugh. It was a desperate sound that held no actual humor. He pointed a shaking finger at me and told me that the board of directors would have these guards fired by morning for letting a convicted criminal crash a private elite event. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and his tailored tuxedo to intimidate me. I did not break eye contact. I informed him that there was no board of directors anymore. I told him he should really pay closer attention to the local commercial real estate auctions instead of spending all his time trying to bury his wife's family. 3 months ago, the Oak Ridge Country Club filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. A private equity firm swooped in and bought the entire estate, the manicured golf course, the clay tennis courts, and this very ballroom for pennies on the dollar. I watched his blue eyes narrow as I delivered the final devastating blow. I told him the name of that firm was Vanguard Capital, and I was the founder and majority shareholder. I did not just walk into his party. I owned the very floor he was standing on. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. I could see the prominent church members in the back row, clutching their evening bags, completely scandalized by the revelation. But the loudest and most visceral reaction came from my own sister. Jada stumbled backward, her custom silk gown rustling loudly as she braced herself against a cocktail table to keep from falling. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She screamed at me, her voice shrill and echoing off the crystal chandeliers, demanding to know how a felon who just walked out of a prison cell could possibly possess that kind of capital. She tried to paint me as a fraud right there in front of the high society she worshipped. She yelled that I was lying, that I had nothing, that I was just the family disgrace trying to ruin her perfect night out of spite. She looked around at the guests, silently begging them to believe her, begging them to see me as the villain she had always portrayed me to be. I turned my attention to her, my expression completely blank and unmoved. I reminded her of the reality she had worked so hard and destroyed my life to cover up. I told her that while she was busy draining our parents' retirement accounts to buy limited edition designer handbags, just so she could impress Julian's snobbish mother at Sunday brunch, I was quietly building a financial empire. I did not spend my 20s chasing country club approvals or begging for a seat at tables where black women were merely tolerated. I built my own table. I reminded her that my firm was securing multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions, while she was still forcing our aging mother to co-sign high-interest loans for her luxury cars. The truth hit her like a physical strike to the chest. Jada opened her mouth to argue, but the words completely failed her. She looked around at her wealthy guests, realizing that her perfectly curated suburban facade was cracking wide open for everyone to see. The women she played tennis with were whispering behind their hands. The men Julian golfed with were staring at her with sudden sharp calculation. Julian stepped in front of Jada again, trying to salvage his crumbling authority. He needed to reclaim the narrative. He relied on the one thing he always used to intimidate people: his corporate status and his generational wealth. He let out another loud, mocking laugh, trying to project a confidence that the sweat beading on his forehead completely betrayed. He told me that buying a bankrupt country club did not make me powerful. He sneered, claiming that my little investment was worthless without the financial backing of the old money families currently standing in this room. He raised his voice, ensuring every executive in the venue could hear him. He announced to the room that his logistics firm held the largest corporate account at this club. He threatened to pull their prestigious membership first thing Monday morning. He boasted that he would personally ensure every other executive in his vast network canceled their memberships too. He promised to ruin the club's revenue stream and drive my investment straight back into the ground, leaving me with nothing but a massive commercial mortgage I could not possibly pay. He actually smiled then, thinking he had checkmated me. He thought he could use his influence to crush me, just like he had done in that courtroom 18 months ago when he painted me as a desperate thief. He expected me to cower and beg for mercy. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely relaxed. I pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with a red wax stamp bearing the Vanguard capital crest. I tossed it effortlessly. It slid smoothly across the surface of the nearest glass cocktail table, stopping exactly inches from Julian's clenched hand. I looked at him, my voice dropping to a deadly absolute calm. I told him he could not pull a membership he had not paid for in 2 years. I watched the color completely drain from his face as I revealed his deepest secret to the entire room. I explained loudly and clearly that the envelope contained the final notice of his delinquent account, totaling over $40,000 in unpaid club dues, dining tabs, and golf fees. The murmurs in the room turned into shocked exclamations. The wealthy elite who had just been drinking his champagne were now looking at him like he was a contagious disease. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The illusion of his immense wealth was shattered in an instant. Before Julian could even reach out with his shaking hand to grab the envelope and hide his shame, a violent commotion erupted near the main entrance. The crowd parted abruptly, shoving each other out of the way. My father Calvin pushed his way through the guests. His face was a deep, dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his starched white collar. He marched straight toward me, his fists clenched at his sides, radiating a blind, irrational fury that I knew all too well. Calvin shoved past the last row of bewildered guests, knocking over a silver tray of champagne flutes. The glass shattered against the marble, but he did not even look down. His chest heaved beneath his tailored tuxedo jacket. The man who had spent his entire life curating an image of unimpeachable respectability for our congregation was unraveling in real time. He stopped inches from my face, pointing a trembling finger directly between my eyes. "What in the world is wrong with you, Imani?" He roared, his voice raw with humiliation. "You march into this establishment dressed like some corporate raider trying to destroy your sister's special night. You are a disgrace to this family and a stain on our church. I will not let you stand here and terrorize Jada and Julian." He reached into his breast pocket, pulling out his smartphone with jerky, frantic movements. "I am calling 911 right now," he threatened. "I am telling them we have a hostile trespasser, and I am having you thrown back into whatever cell you just crawled out of." The air in the ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. The guests held their collective breath, waiting for me to shatter. They expected the familiar sight of a broken daughter begging her father for mercy. But the woman standing before Calvin was no longer his terrified little girl. I stared dead into his eyes, unblinking and completely devoid of fear. "Go ahead, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor. "Make sure you dial a 9 to get an outside line, just like you did 18 months ago when you stood in your home office and stepped right over my body while I was crying on the hardwood floor. Do you remember that, Dad? Do you remember looking down at me, bleeding from where Julian pushed me, and calmly telling the dispatcher that your youngest daughter was aggressively stealing from your son-in-law's corporate accounts?" Calvin's finger froze in midair. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. His thumb hovered over his phone screen, but he could not bring himself to press the numbers. The truth of my words hit him with the blunt force of a physical strike. I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard, entirely stripped of his righteous indignation. The whispers from the surrounding elite grew louder, catching wind of the dark reality behind their perfect country club facade. Before Calvin could formulate a single excuse, my mother thrust herself into the confrontation. Yvonne positioned herself squarely in front of Jada, throwing her arms out as if I were a predator about to attack her golden child. She wore a diamond necklace that sparkled under the chandeliers, a gift bought with the very funds they had sacrificed me to secure. "Do not you dare speak to your father that way!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice pitching high and defensive. "You have no right to come in here and play the victim, Imani. You made your choices and you paid the price. Look at you trying to act like you own the world, just because you bought some bankrupt building. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter convict trying to tear down a marriage you could never have." She puffed out her chest, drawing courage from her own delusions of grandeur. "You want to talk about money?" Yvonne continued loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear her validation of Julian. "You want to pretend you are some financial genius. You are nothing compared to the man Jada married. Julian just secured a $50 million logistics contract for his firm this morning. $50 million, Imani. He is the true provider of this family. He takes care of us. He bought us our new cars, and he funds our church donations. Julian is a man of real wealth and character, while you are just an angry ex-con trying to drag us down to your level. Yvonne looked around the room, seeking the nodding approval of the other wealthy mothers. She expected her speech to solidify Julian's status as the untouchable white knight who had generously uplifted our family. She thought throwing his corporate victory in my face would completely invalidate my presence. I stood perfectly still, letting her words hang in the stagnant air of the ballroom. I looked at Yvonne and then at Julian, who was standing behind her, desperately trying to maintain his posture of superiority. A slow, cold laugh bubbled up from my chest, escaping my lips and echoing across the silent room. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was the sound of an absolute predator, recognizing that its prey had just walked willingly into the trap. Yvonne's triumphant smile faltered. "What is so funny?" She snapped her hands, clenching into fists at her sides. I reached smoothly into the pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the ballroom. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, tapping the screen with one deliberate motion. "Let us take a look at that $50 million contract, Mom." The massive projector screens behind the grand stage were supposed to be playing a highly curated slideshow of Jada and Julian's perfect life. They had planned to display photos of their vacations in Mykonos, their matching holiday pajamas, and their flawless, pristine smiles to the entire congregation. Instead, the screens went completely black for a split second before a harsh, sterile light illuminated the entire ballroom. A live Bloomberg financial terminal filled the massive 20-foot display. The ticker symbol for Julian's logistics company pulsed angrily at the very top of the screen in bright red font. Beneath it, a jagged red line plummeted in a near-vertical drop. It was a financial bloodbath happening in real time. Millions of dollars in market capitalization were being wiped out second by second. The guests, heavily populated by corporate hounds, investment bankers, and real estate moguls, immediately recognized exactly what they were looking at. The gasps that rippled through the crowd this time were not born out of social scandal. They were the sounds of pure, unadulterated financial terror. Julian spun around. The arrogant posture he had maintained just moments ago shattered instantly. His perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its form as he stared at the plummeting red line, as if it were a physical monster coming to devour him alive. He barked at the audio-visual team stationed in the balcony to turn the screens off, but they did not touch a single control. They worked for the club, and the club worked for me. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the spacious room. I addressed my mother first while keeping my eyes locked on the chaotic numbers flashing on the screen. "You were just bragging about that $50 million logistics contract, Mom," I said, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the room. "You said it proved Julian was the ultimate provider. What your perfect son-in-law failed to mention to his board of directors is that his firm was heavily over-leveraged. They were drowning in quiet debt and could not secure a traditional banking loan to save their lives. They had to seek out private equity to underwrite the deal to secure an anonymous lead investor to keep the illusion of solvency alive." Julian turned back to me, his blue eyes wide with a dawning, horrified realization. The impenetrable shield of his corporate white privilege was cracking right in front of my eyes. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the system would always protect him while punishing women who looked exactly like me. He tried to deny it. He shouted to the room that I was bluffing. He claimed that a convicted felon could not possibly own a private equity firm with the capital to underwrite a $50 million deal. He tried to rally his peers, telling them not to listen to a woman who had spent the last year and a half behind bars. But numbers do not lie, and the massive screen behind him was broadcasting his failure to the entire world. I projected my voice louder, addressing the silent room of elites. I told them that Vanguard Capital is not just a real estate holding company that buys up bankrupt country clubs. We are an aggressive private equity firm that swallows failing companies whole. I looked right at Julian. "I personally authorized the underwriting for your $50 million lifeline, Julian. And exactly 4 minutes ago, I filed a formal notice with the Securities and Exchange Commission to pull all of our funding." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but he could not catch his breath. The sheer magnitude of the trap I had laid for him was paralyzing. The reason I filed for the immediate withdrawal. I continued casually inspecting my manicure is gross, executive misconduct, and suspected corporate fraud. This triggers an automatic breach of contract clause freezing all operating capital immediately. The word fraud echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Julian's wealthy investors, who were currently standing around eating his expensive appetizers, started murmuring frantically. Dozens of men in expensive suits pulled out their own smartphones, desperately checking their portfolios and whispering fiercely to their brokers. Yvonne stood frozen next to her golden child. The diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looked like a heavy chain. She had spent the last hour tearing down my character to elevate Julian, and now the man she worshipped as the savior of our family was exposed as a financial liability. She tried to speak to ask Julian to tell everyone it was a joke, but the sheer panic radiating from his trembling body silenced her completely. Julian reached into his tuxedo jacket with a shaking hand. He needed to make a call to do damage control, but before he could even unlock his screen, his phone began to vibrate violently. A harsh buzzing sound cut through the heavy tension of the ballroom. He stared at the caller identification, and the last remaining drop of blood left his face. He looked absolutely terrified. He answered the call, placing the phone to his ear with trembling fingers. The acoustics in the grand ballroom were flawless. The voice on the other end of the line was so loud and so furious that the people standing in the front row could hear the muffled shouting. It was his board of directors. They were demanding his immediate resignation. They were screaming that the federal regulators were already calling their legal department to freeze their assets based on the Vanguard filing. Julian stammered, trying to use his smooth corporate jargon to buy time. He promised them he could fix it. He swore it was a misunderstanding caused by a disgruntled former employee. But the people on the other end of the line did not care about his excuses. They severed him completely. The line went dead. Julian dropped the phone. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, echoing the absolute destruction of his career. Jada watched her husband crumble and realized her entire social standing was evaporating into thin air. The country club elite were no longer looking at her with envy or admiration. They were looking at her like a sinking ship that they needed to distance themselves from immediately. The lavish anniversary party she had spent months planning, the dress she bought, the image she worshipped, it was all burning to ashes. She lunged forward, her face contorted in a mix of absolute panic and vicious hatred. The elegant facade she maintained for the church and the society pages was completely gone. She screamed at me, her voice raw and shrill. She demanded to know what I did. She accused me of ruining her life, of destroying her husband's flawless career out of petty, bitter jealousy because I was nothing but a criminal. I looked at my sister, my expression completely devoid of sympathy. I let a cold, calculated silence stretch between us before I delivered the absolute truth. I did not do anything, Jada. I am just correcting a clerical error you made 18 months ago. Jada stared at me as the reality of my words sank in. She realized the private conversation with Julian was a lost cause because his career was actively disintegrating in front of his peers. She did the only thing she knew how to do when backed into a corner. She pivoted to her audience. She forced tears to well up in her perfectly lined eyes, playing the ultimate victim for the crowd. She turned away from me and faced the country club elite, throwing her hands up in a dramatic display of helplessness. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction, her voice breaking with manufactured sorrow. She told the room that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous ex-convict trying to ruin her perfect life. She cried to the wealthy executives and the judgmental women from our church congregation, claiming that I had spent my entire life envying her flawless marriage and her beautiful suburban existence. She spun a tragic tale right there on the marble floor, telling everyone that going to prison had broken my mind. She said I was obsessed with destroying her out of pure spite because I could not handle my own failures. She sobbed into her hands, leaning heavily into her role as the innocent socialite under attack by a deranged criminal. The older church ladies in the front row murmured in sympathy, clutching their pearl necklaces and shaking their heads at me, completely buying into Jada's masterful performance. She always knew how to manipulate a room. Growing up, if she broke a vase, she would cry so hard my parents would end up comforting her while punishing me for leaving the vase too close to the edge. Now she was doing the exact same thing on a much larger scale. She looked at the country club president and his wife weaving a story about how my time away had made me vindictive. She claimed she had tried to visit me and sent letters that I refused to answer. Every word spilling from her mouth was a calculated fabrication meant to preserve her standing in the high society she valued more than her own sister. I stood perfectly still and let her cry. I let her spin her pathetic web of lies while the entire crowd watched. I waited until she paused to take a dramatic breath before I made my move. I stepped right past her, walking deliberately towards the center of the ballroom, where the catering staff had set up an elaborate spread. I looked around the room, locking eyes with the very people who were just whispering about me. I raised my voice, asking the crowd if everyone was enjoying the imported caviar and the vintage champagne. I reached into my designer bag and wrapped my fingers around a thick, heavy stack of paper. I pulled out the bundle of official bank documents and tossed them high into the air. The heavy papers fluttered down like snow, landing on the crystal glasses, the white tablecloths, and the polished dance floor. I announced to the room that the champagne they were drinking was bought on borrowed time, just like the sprawling six-bedroom mansion Jada bragged about every Sunday at church. I watched as curious guests reached down to pick up the papers. Their eyes widened as they read the bold red ink. I revealed to the entire congregation that her perfect estate was deeply in arrears. The bank had been trying to serve them eviction papers for 6 months, but they kept dodging the process servers to maintain their illusion of wealth. I told the room that these foreclosure notices are public record. Anyone with a smartphone and a basic understanding of county property laws could look them up. I explained that the catering staff serving them duck confit probably have better credit scores than the golden couple standing before them. The humiliation on Jada's face was visceral. The facade of perfection she had so carefully curated was crumbling into dust right in front of the people she wanted to impress the most. Jada's fake tears instantly dried up. Her mouth dropped open, but she could not find her voice. The sympathetic murmurs from the church ladies abruptly stopped, replaced by the sharp intake of breath that comes with high society scandal. I stepped closer to my sister, dropping my tone to a deadly serious pitch that carried perfectly through the silent ballroom. You told Mom you could not afford a lawyer for my bail because you were remodeling the nursery, I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I reminded her of the exact night she stood in my apartment while the police were processing my arrest. You said your family had to come first, and that babies were expensive. But public records show you took out a third mortgage that exact same week to pay off Julian's offshore gambling debts in Macau. The guests gasped. Julian shrank back into the shadows, suddenly trying to make himself as small as possible. I kept my eyes locked on Jada, stripping away every last shred of her dignity. You let me rot in a concrete cell to protect a gambling addict who was bleeding your accounts dry. You let me eat state-issued trays while you threw away our family's legacy on a man who could not even afford his own country club dues. Before Jada could formulate a single excuse, my mother. Yvonne let out a piercing shriek. She lunged forward, pushing past a waiter. Her face was contorted with absolute rage. Yvonne never saw my worth. She only saw what I could not provide, which was a wealthy white son-in-law and an entry pass into the elite circles of suburban society. She had spent her entire life protecting Jada and Julian because they represented the proximity to wealth and status she so desperately craved. She raised her hand high into the air, swinging it down with all her might, aiming to slap me right across the face. She screamed that I was a liar, tearing her beautiful family apart with my jealous delusions. She expected me to take the hit, just like I had taken the fall for their crimes. She expected the obedient scapegoat to bow her head and accept the punishment. She was not just defending Jada, she was defending her own choices. She was defending the narrative that justified sacrificing me. If I am telling the truth, then she is a monster for letting me take the fall. So she had to believe I was a liar. But I am not that woman anymore. I raised my arm and caught her wrist effortlessly in midair. My grip was like iron, stopping her hand mere inches from my cheek. Catching her wrist was the physical manifestation of me finally stopping the generational trauma. I was physically halting the abuse. I held her wrist suspended, feeling her pulse racing against my palm. I looked at my mother with absolute zero emotion. If I am lying, Mom, why is Julian's Porsche actively being hooked to a tow truck outside the window? I release my mother's wrist with a sharp, dismissive flick of my hand, causing her to stumble backward into my father's chest. I do not spare her another glance. Instead, I point directly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the east wall of the ballroom. Julian whips his head around, following my gaze. Outside, under the amber glow of the valet parking lights, a heavy-duty tow truck is actively hoisting his custom silver Porsche Panamera into the air. The vehicle he flaunted at every family dinner. The ultimate symbol of his supposed corporate superiority is being strapped down with heavy industrial chains and hauled away like abandoned trash. The elite crowd presses against the glass, pointing and whispering. The flashing yellow lights of the tow truck paint the dark ballroom windows, casting erratic shadows across the horrified faces of the country club members. The humiliation is absolute and undeniable. The sight of his prized possession being repossessed snaps the very last thread of Julian's carefully constructed corporate sanity. The polished, charming executive facade completely evaporates. He turns back to me, and the man standing there is a desperate cornered animal realizing the trap has just snapped shut on his leg. He closes the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides. My security guards immediately step forward to intercept him, but I raise 2 fingers, stopping them in their tracks. I want to handle this myself. I want him to look me in the eye. Julian uses his height, trying to loom over me, casting a shadow meant to make me feel small and defenseless. He invades my personal space, stopping mere inches from my face. I can smell the expensive scotch on his breath and see the frantic pulse beating wildly in his neck. His face is flushed a deep, angry red. He leans down, lowering his voice to a venomous, fierce whisper meant only for my ears, so the wealthy onlookers cannot hear his mask cracking. "You think you can play games with me, Imani?" He hisses, his face contorted with pure rage. "You think buying some bankrupt real estate and pulling a few financial strings makes you untouchable. You are nothing. You are a convicted felon who just walked out of a cage. I am a senior finance executive from a family that helped build this city. Who do you honestly think these people are going to believe? Who do you think the authorities will listen to? They will never take the word of a black female ex-con over a wealthy white man in a tuxedo. I will crush you all over again, and this time I will make sure they throw away the key. I do not take a single step back. I do not blink. I do not let a muscle in my face betray even a fraction of an inch of intimidation. I survived 540 days, surrounded by concrete and steel. I survived prison lockdowns, violent cellmates, and the bone-chilling cold of isolation. This soft, arrogant man in a rented suit does not terrify me. He disgusts me. That is exactly the strategy you banked on 18 months ago. Julian, I reply, my voice perfectly steady, cutting through his desperate bluster like a scalpel. That was your entire business plan. You knew the internal auditors were closing in on the $4 million you embezzled to cover your massive offshore gambling debts. You knew you needed a scapegoat to take the fall. And you looked at your wife's sister and saw the perfect disposable target. I step even closer to him, forcing him to either hold his ground or retreat. He swallows hard, his jaw clenching, but he stays planted. You used my race and my gender as a weapon. I continue, my tone dropping to a lethal calm that makes the blood drain from his face. You knew the justice system is rigged to believe a man who looks like you and doubt a woman who looks like me. You falsified my digital signature on those corporate transfer documents. You routed the stolen funds through the dummy accounts you set up under my name. You engineered a flawless paper trail, knowing the detectives would take one look at the demographics and close the case without digging deeper. You weaponized systemic bias to save your own skin, and you let my parents cheer you on while you did it. Julian sneers, a nasty, arrogant twist of his lips. He tries to pull his superiority back around him like a protective blanket. And it worked beautifully. He whispers back, a cruel, desperate spark of triumph returning to his eyes. You went away. I kept my job. I kept my house. And I kept your sister. You have no proof, Imani. You have zero evidence. You can buy all the country clubs in the state, but you cannot rewrite the court record. It is your word against mine, and my word is backed by generational wealth. You are playing a game you have already lost. I let a genuine, relaxed smile touch my lips. It is the kind of smile that makes powerful men very nervous because it holds no fear. You are absolutely right, Julian, I say softly. If this were just my word against yours, I would lose. I learned very quickly, sitting in that courtroom, that the truth does not set you free. Leverage sets you free. Power sets you free. So I stopped looking for fairness, and I started accumulating power. Julian frowns, his arrogant sneer faltering, as my utter lack of panic severely rattles him. He glances nervously at Jada, who is still sobbing into my mother's shoulder. He looks back at me, trying to calculate what angle I could possibly be playing. He firmly believes he destroyed all the evidence. He believes he scrubbed the company servers, wiped the hard drives, and erased every single digital footprint connecting him to the crime before the trial even began. He thinks he is completely safe in his web of lies. You think you wiped the slate clean, I tell him, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. You think erasing a few hard drives made you invisible. But the game has changed, Julian. I slowly raise my right hand, lifting it high above the crowd. I point my finger directly upward, signaling the audio technician working in the elevated sound booth at the very back of the grand ballroom. The technician, a loyal, well-paid employee of Vanguard Capital, nods once. The massive surround sound speakers mounted across the vaulted ceiling suddenly emit a sharp, piercing static crackle, bringing the murmuring guests to absolute dead silence. The static cleared instantly, replaced by a deep, rich baritone that every executive in the room recognized immediately. It was Julian's voice, completely relaxed, untroubled, and dripping with arrogant entitlement. "Are you sure her password still works?" Jada's voice followed, coming through the high-definition speakers with terrifying clarity. It was unmistakable. The same sweet melodic tone she used to lead Sunday school solos, now discussing the casual destruction of my life. "Of course it works," Julian's recorded voice replied, accompanied by the distinct clinking of ice in a whiskey glass. "She leaves her credentials saved on the shared network drive because she actually trusts her loving family. I already set up the shell accounts under her name. $4 million goes out tonight. By the time the auditors flag the discrepancy on Monday, the paper trail points straight to your brilliant sister. Is Dad really going to believe she did it?" Jada's recorded voice giggled, a light, frivolous sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Calvin will believe whatever protects your family image, babe," Julian had answered. "The moment the police show up, your dad will throw her to the wolves just to keep your white knight in the family. Besides, who is a jury going to believe, a rising star finance executive or a black girl who is always one step away from being the outcast?" The recording played on, but the silence inside the grand ballroom was so profound you could hear the hum of the air conditioning units. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The country club elite, the church elders, the prominent local business owners, they stood frozen like statues, their eyes darting from the speakers to the golden couple standing beside the stage. Yvonne's jaw dropped so low her lower lip trembled uncontrollably. Calvin's eyes were wide, bloodshot, staring at the floor as if the earth had opened up beneath him. The illusion of his wholly perfect family didn't just crack, it disintegrated into dust. Julian's face went from pale to a terrifying mottled purple. He lunged toward the stage, screaming at the top of his lungs at the audio booth. "Turn it off! Turn that damn thing off! It is a fake! It is a deep fake!" he shrieked, his voice cracking violently. He turned back toward the crowd, his hands shaking so hard he could barely keep them steady. "Do not listen to this. She created this with artificial intelligence. She synthesized our voices. I wiped those servers myself 2 years ago. There was no file. There was nothing left." He stopped mid-sentence, his own words betraying him. The crowd gasped again. He had just admitted in his unhinged panic that there had been something to wipe in the first place. I stepped closer to him, my customized Tom Ford suit unwrinkled, my posture straight and commanding. I let a small, razor-sharp smile show on my face. "You are right about one thing, Julian," I said, my voice smooth and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the room. "You did wipe the company's local servers. You were very thorough. You wiped the hard drives, you ran the shredder programs, and you paid off your IT director to look the other way. You thought you were the smartest white man in the room. I paused, looking at him with cool pity. What you forgot, Julian, is that modern cloud infrastructure creates redundancy across multiple geographic locations. You scrubbed the Atlanta servers, but you did not know the parent corporation backed up encrypted system logs to a secondary facility in Zurich every 48 hours. Julian stared at me, his eyes glassy with horror. How did you get Zurich logs? He rasped, his voice barely a whisper now. You were in a federal facility. I had 15 minutes of telephone privileges every Tuesday afternoon, I answered calmly. While you were using your money to buy custom suits and throw anniversary galas, I was using my one phone call a week to direct my legal team. I hired a digital forensics firm out of New York, the kind of cutthroat engineers who charge $1,000 an hour and do not stop until they find blood. It took them 10 months to subpoena the Swiss backup nodes, decrypt your erased audio logs, and reconstruct every single keystroke you made using my login. I stepped directly into his line of sight, forcing him to look at me. You thought prison was meant to break me, Julian. But all it did was give me a quiet room to plan your execution. Calvin slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes fixing on Jada. Jada, he choked out his voice, hollow, stripped of all its previous thunder. Jada, tell me that was not you. Tell me you did not do that to your sister. Jada could not answer. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving against her silk gown, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape hatch. And then, cornered, exposed, and facing the utter annihilation of his career and freedom, Julian's chivalry completely vanished. The wealthy, polite white executive turned on his golden black wife with the ferocity of a rabid dog. Julian grabbed Jada by her shoulders, shaking her violently right in front of the entire congregation. Tell him, Julian screamed into her face, his voice ringing across the ballroom. Tell your father the truth. Jada, it was your idea. You came to me crying because you wanted the house, you wanted the ring, and you hated that Imani was making more money than you. You were the one who gave me her passwords. You signed her name on the offshore transfers. Do not you dare let me take the fall for your sick, twisted jealousy. Julian did not stop there. He let his survival instinct completely override his marriage vows. He took another step away from Jada, physically distancing himself from her, as if her very presence was toxic. He projected his voice to the stunned crowd, ensuring every single investment banker and country club socialite heard his defense. He shouted that Jada had been obsessed with my success from the moment I bought my first property. He exposed her deepest, darkest insecurities to the entire room. He told them she was terrified of being exposed as a fraud. She hated that I was building a legitimate financial portfolio while she was maxing out credit cards to buy designer shoes just to keep up with the wealthy white women in his social circle. She needed that $4 million to maintain the illusion that she belonged in this elite world. Julian painted himself as the naive husband who had simply trusted his wife, who had been manipulated by a desperate woman trying to fund her country club lifestyle. He threw her to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation, using her as a human shield to protect his own corporate reputation. The betrayal shattered whatever fragile grip Jada still had on her sanity. The pristine, elegant image she had curated for the church congregation and the society pages evaporated in a split second. She let out a sound that was barely human, a primal shrieking wail of absolute humiliation and pure rage. She lunged toward a nearby catering station, her eyes wild and unhinged. She grabbed a heavy crystal champagne flute from an abandoned silver tray and hurled it directly at Julian's head with all her might. Julian ducked, but he was not fast enough. The heavy glass missed his face by a fraction of an inch and shattered violently against his left shoulder. A shower of sharp crystal fragments and expensive vintage champagne exploded across his crisp white tuxedo shirt. Julian stumbled backward, shouting in shock and pain, but Jada did not stop. She rushed him, her manicured nails clawing wildly at his chest and tearing at his lapels. She screamed right back at him, her voice tearing through her vocal cords as she exposed his pathetic reality to the very people he was trying to impress. She yelled that he was a complete fraud. She told the room that his family trust fund had cut him off 3 years ago because he could not stop betting on illegal offshore sports syndicates. She admitted she gave him my login passwords, but she screamed that Julian was the true mastermind. He was the one who forged the final digital signatures. How was the one crying on their bathroom floor begging her to help him frame me because his loan sharks were threatening to break his legs and ruin his family name. She shrieked that she only did it to save him from being murdered over his gambling debts. The entire grand ballroom transformed into a digital coliseum. The wealthy elite, the conservative church elders, the women who used to kiss the ground. Jada walked on. They were all holding up their smartphones. The harsh, bright glare of dozens of camera flashes illuminated the room. They were recording every single second of the golden couple tearing each other to pieces. This was social annihilation happening in real time. I watched the lenses tracking their every move, knowing this video would be on every local gossip blog, corporate news forum, and society page before midnight. Jada was completely unhinged, sobbing and spitting venom, while Julian tried to shove her off him, his white knight savior complex completely obliterated. Up in the sound booth, my audio technician had set the recording on a continuous loop. Just as Jada and Julian were physically wrestling with each other, the audio track restarted from the beginning. Julian and Jada were forced to hear their own recorded voices plotting my downfall all over again. The sound of their cold, calculated laughter from 2 years ago echoed directly above their current pathetic physical brawl. The stark contrast between their arrogant past and their desperate present was poetic justice in its purest form. The violent spectacle finally snapped my parents out of their paralyzed shock. The sight of their precious golden child having a public meltdown in front of the cameras jolted them into action. Calvin and Yvonne rushed across the marble floor, their formal shoes slipping on the spilled champagne and broken crystal. They did not go to Julian. They completely ignored the wealthy white executive they had worshipped as the savior of our family just an hour ago. They rushed straight to Jada. Yvonne threw her arms around her struggling daughter, trying to shield Jada's ruined, tear-stained face from the flashing smartphone cameras. Yvonne was weeping hysterically, stroking Jada's messy hair, treating her like an innocent victim who had just survived a terrible accident. She glared at Julian with pure, unadulterated hatred, but she did not dare attack him physically. Instead, my parents turned their desperate, panicked eyes toward me. Calvin left Yvonne to hold back a thrashing Jada and practically sprinted over to where I was standing. He stopped just inches away from me. His designer suit was rumpled. His breathing was ragged and heavy. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had threatened to have me arrested and thrown back in a cell just 20 minutes ago was now trembling like a frightened child. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he did not even bother to wipe it away. He pointed frantically up at the sound booth where my technician was monitoring the looping audio track. He begged me to raise my hand and signaled the DJ to cut the feed. He pleaded with me to stop the public humiliation, to order my security guards to clear the room, to show his family some mercy. He looked at me, not with the pride of a father who just realized his scapegoat daughter was actually a massive success, but with the sheer blinding panic of a man whose entire social universe was burning to ashes. He did not care that I was innocent. He only cared that the church congregation was watching his legacy crumble. I looked at the sweat dripping from my father's chin. I looked at the way his hands shook as he reached out toward me, begging for salvation from the very daughter he had discarded. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He was standing in a building that I owned, asking me to silence the truth, because the truth was inconvenient for his social standing. He wanted me to protect the sister who had just openly confessed to framing me for a federal crime. The looping audio track played on in the background. Jada's recorded voice laughed through the speakers, asking if Dad was really going to believe I did it. Julian's recorded voice answered that Calvin would believe whatever protected his family image. The recording was narrating the exact reality playing out in front of us. My father was proving Julian right in real time, even after hearing Jada admit to forging documents, even after watching Julian confess to massive corporate theft. My father was still trying to protect the illusion. He was still trying to shield Jada from the consequences of her own actions. The guests were not leaving. Nobody was rushing for the coat check or heading toward the valet parking. They were completely captivated by the destruction of the Davis family. I watched a prominent deacon from our church recording the entire scene on his phone, shaking his head in absolute disgust. I saw the wives of Julian's corporate partners texting furiously on their screens, likely spreading the news of the embezzlement to their husbands' business rivals. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Jada and Julian were permanently exiled from this world. They would never sit at these tables again. They would never be invited to another gala, another charity auction, or another Sunday service without being the absolute center of a massive scandal. Julian finally managed to push Jada away from him. He stumbled backward, his tuxedo jacket torn and soaked in alcohol. He looked around the room, his chest heaving, realizing that he was completely surrounded by hostile witnesses. The people he had considered his peers were looking at him with absolute contempt. He had been exposed not just as a thief, but as a coward who would gladly sacrifice a black woman to the prison system to save his own skin, and then publicly attack his own wife when the truth finally caught up to him. He was ruined. Jada collapsed against Yvonne, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. Yvonne glared at me, her eyes filled with bitter accusation, as if I were the one who forced them to steal $4 million. As if I were the one who made them lie to the federal authorities. They still wanted me to be the villain because accepting that their golden child was a manipulative criminal was simply too much for their fragile egos to handle. Calvin stepped closer to me, attempting to block my view of the crowd. He reached out and grabbed my forearm, his grip tight and desperate. He lowered his voice, trying to keep the nearby guests from hearing his pathetic negotiations. He promised me that they would make it right. He promised that Julian would pay back whatever money was owed. He swore that they would publicly clear my name if I just stopped the recording and let them handle this quietly as a family. I was actually trying to bargain with me, as if my freedom and my trauma were just line items on a spreadsheet to be balanced out. I stared at his hand gripping my tailored sleeve. I did not pull away immediately. I wanted to feel the tremor in his fingers. I wanted to commit this exact moment to memory. I wanted to remember the sensation of my father begging me for mercy after he had shown me absolutely none. "We are blood, Imani," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the heavy weight of his desperation. "You cannot destroy your sister." "Blood," I repeated, the word rolling off my tongue like a bitter curse. I let out a sharp laugh that contained absolutely no joy. It was a sound dripping with absolute disdain, echoing across the silent ballroom, and making my father physically flinch. "Blood, you say? Let us talk about what that blood actually cost me, Dad. Let us talk about the black tax I paid for 10 years while you and Mom treated me like the family ATM. I stepped away from his grasping hands, smoothing the lapels of my suit. I projected my voice so every single deacon and choir member from our church could hear exactly how Calvin and Yvonne funded their holy lifestyle. I paid the mortgage on your 5-bedroom house when Dad's consulting business went under 6 years ago. I covered the property taxes every single quarter so you would not lose that pristine manicured lawn you love to show off. When the church started its new building fund, you pledged $50,000 just so you could keep your prestigious front row deacon seats and maintain your status in the congregation. But you did not have $50,000, did you, Dad? I wrote that check. I wired that money silently through my firm so you could stand at the pulpit and receive the applause. I bought Mom that luxury SUV she drives to her prayer meetings. I kept this entire family financially afloat quietly and consistently, without ever asking for a single word of recognition. I watched my parents shrink under the weight of my exposure. The church elders sitting at the nearby tables were staring at Calvin with open shock, murmuring quietly among themselves. His holy facade was completely stripped away. "And how did you repay that loyalty?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal frozen calm. "How did you repay the daughter who carried the financial weight of this entire family on her back? You stood at the Thanksgiving table and openly praised Jada. You bragged to everyone about how successful she was because she managed to marry a wealthy white executive who threw some stolen corporate scraps your way. You worshipped Julian because his proximity to generational wealth made you feel important. You traded your hard-working, dark-skinned daughter for a front-row seat to a country club lifestyle that never even belonged to you." Yvonne began to weep loudly, covering her face with her hands. She tried to step forward, stammering that they did not know the money was stolen, that Julian had deceived them too. "Do not play the victim, Mom," I snapped, shutting her down instantly. You knew exactly who I was and you knew exactly who they were. But when Julian pointed his finger at me and accused me of stealing $4 million, you did not hesitate for a single second. You did not hire a lawyer for me. You did not stand up for me in court. You threw me to the wolves because defending me meant losing your country club access, and admitting your perfect son-in-law was a degenerate gambling addict. I stepped closer to my parents, forcing them to look at the hardened woman they had created. Let me give you a reality check about what your blood truly means. I told them, my eyes locked onto my father's terrified face. I spent 540 days in a 6 by 8 foot concrete box. 540 days eating state-issued food, sleeping on a thin cot, and submitting to strip searches by guards who looked at me like I was an animal. I lost 18 months of my life, surrounded by steel bars and razor wire, while you all sat in this exact ballroom sipping champagne and celebrating the wealth you stole from my reputation. Calvin shook his head, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. We were scared, Imani. We did not know what to do. You knew exactly what to do. I fired back, my anger finally rising to the surface, hot and absolute. You abandoned me. I was allowed one 15-minute phone call every Tuesday afternoon. I saved those minutes like they were oxygen. And I remember the exact Tuesday I called you Mom. I was terrified. I was facing violence in my cell block, and I just needed to hear my mother's voice. I used my one call for the week and dialed your cell phone. Yvonne let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob, shaking her head frantically side to side as if she could shake away the memory. I listened to the phone ring 4 times. I continued relentlessly painting the picture for the entire room. And then I heard the click of the line being deliberately rejected. You sent me straight to voicemail. Do you want to know how I found out why you rejected my call, Mom? Because the next day the prison guards let us watch the morning entertainment news. And there was a segment on local socialites. You were busy at a wine tasting in Napa Valley with Jada and Julian. You were swirling expensive Pinot Noir on a trip funded by the money Julian stole, and you could not be bothered to take a collect call from your daughter, who was fighting for her life in a federal facility. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The horrifying reality of their betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jada, who had been weeping on the floor, slowly looked up. Her makeup completely ruined, her designer silk gown stained with champagne and dirt. She looked at me with a sudden dawning realization that there was absolutely no mercy left in my heart. The sister she grew up with, the sister she manipulated and abused, was dead. Calvin dropped to his knees right there on the marble floor. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me like I was a judge about to hand down a death sentence. Imani, please, he wept, his pride completely broken. I am begging you. We will do anything. We will sell the house. We will pay you back every cent. Just please tell Vanguard to drop the investigation. Please do not let them take Jada away. We are your family. I looked down at the man who was supposed to protect me. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow, just the cold, sterile satisfaction of watching the natural consequences of his actions finally catch up to him. I opened my mouth to deliver the final nail in their coffin, the heavy, stagnant atmosphere of the grand ballroom. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing off the manicured hills of the golf course outside. Within seconds, the sound grew rapidly louder, multiplying and layering upon itself. It was the sharp, aggressive shriek of heavy sirens approaching at high speed. The wail pierced the thick glass windows of the country club, drowning out the quiet murmurs of the wealthy guests. Simultaneously, the ambient lighting inside the ballroom was interrupted. Fierce, strobing flashes of red and blue light began to reflect off the crystal chandeliers and wash across the stark white walls. The emergency vehicles were pulling directly into the circular driveway of the club, barricading the main entrance. Jada stopped crying. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes widened into massive saucers of absolute unadulterated terror as the flashing blue lights illuminated her tear-stained face. She slowly turned her head, looking from the windows back to me, her body trembling so violently, her teeth were chattering. Julian, who had been leaning heavily against a cocktail table, let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He looked like a man watching his own executioner walk up the steps to the gallows. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom, the same ones I had kicked open just an hour ago, suddenly burst wide open. The wail of the sirens grew deafening, tearing through the pristine acoustics of the ballroom. Jada lunged at me. Her perfectly manicured hands clamped onto my forearm, her acrylic nails digging sharply through the fabric of my tailored suit. Her entire body was trembling. The facade of the confident suburban socialite was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered fugitive. "Did you call the police?" She choked out her voice, barely a ragged whisper. Her eyes darted wildly toward the massive windows, where the flashing red and blue lights were currently bathing the manicured lawns in a harsh neon glow. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm, and I slowly shook my head. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the absolute certainty of her destruction wash over her. "No, Jada," I replied. "I did not call the local police. Local law enforcement would not even begin to understand the complex offshore routing protocols you and Julian used to hide that money. Local cops just put people in handcuffs and ask questions later, which is exactly what they did to me when you let them drag me out of our childhood home. I wanted something much more thorough for you. I called the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. Embezzling $4 million and wiring it across state lines and international borders is a major federal offense." Jada let go of my arm as if the fabric of my suit had suddenly caught fire. She staggered backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth to stifle a scream. Before anyone else could react, the heavy double oak doors of the ballroom were thrown violently open for the second time tonight. A wave of agents flooded into the venue. They were not wearing formal attire. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. They moved with a terrifying coordinated efficiency, fanning out across the perimeter of the room and immediately securing every single exit. The luxurious atmosphere of the 5-year anniversary gala evaporated in an instant. The glamorous venue was abruptly transformed into an active federal crime scene. The string quartet players had completely abandoned their instruments. The catering staff backed away from the carving stations, holding their hands up nervously. The elite country club members, the wealthy investors, the conservative church elders, they all scrambled backward, desperately trying to distance themselves from the center of the room where my family stood. Nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. I watched the head deacon of our church practically sprint toward the patio doors, his earlier expressions of holy judgment completely replaced by sheer self-preservation. Yvonne let out a weak, pathetic whimper and collapsed into a velvet dining chair. She buried her face in her hands, unable to watch the physical manifestation of her social annihilation. She had spent decades building her reputation in the Black community, serving on church committees, and bragging about her proximity to Julian's white generational wealth. Now she was sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne, watching federal agents secure the room. Calvin stood completely frozen beside her. His chest heaved, but he could not move a single muscle. The proud patriarch who cared more about optics than his own daughter was currently trapped in the ultimate public nightmare. But Julian refused to accept his reality. He simply could not compute that the rules applied to him. He was a wealthy white corporate executive standing in an exclusive country club surrounded by his peers. He truly believed his pedigree granted him absolute immunity from the kind of humiliation playing out in front of him. He straightened his posture, attempting to smooth down the front of his torn and alcohol-stained tuxedo jacket. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and marched aggressively toward the front of the room. He bypassed Jada entirely, leaving her sobbing on the floor, and stepped directly into the path of the lead federal agent. The agent was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely impassive expression who looked entirely unimpressed by the crystal chandeliers and the imported floral arrangements. Julian puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and his booming corporate voice to intimidate the federal officer. He pointed a rigid finger at the agent, acting as if he were dressing down an insubordinate employee in a boardroom. "What the hell do you think you are doing, crashing a private event?" Julian demanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You have absolutely no jurisdiction to storm a private country club without prior authorization. I am a senior finance executive, and this is an egregious violation of my rights." The lead agent did not even blink. He calmly reached inside his windbreaker, pulling out a thick, folded stack of legal documents. He looked at Julian with the cold, detached professionalism of someone who arrested arrogant executives for a living. Julian did not wait for the agent to speak. He decided to play his final ultimate card. He decided to wield the heavy shield of his family name. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Julian shouted, stepping even closer to the agent. "Do you know who my father is? My father is Judge Thomas Davis. He sits on the federal appellate court for this district. He plays golf with the governor. You are making a massive career-ending mistake. I demand that you call your supervisor and stand down this entire raid immediately before I have your badge and your pension stripped by morning." The silence that followed Julian's arrogant threat was suffocating. The remaining guests held their breath, waiting to see if the invocation of a powerful federal judge would actually force the authorities to retreat. Jada looked up from the floor, a tiny glimmer of desperate hope flashing in her tear-filled eyes. She still believed that Julian's white knight privilege could somehow save them from the nightmare they had created. She was praying that his generational power would be the magic eraser they always used to wipe away their mistakes. The lead agent looked Julian up and down, taking in the torn tuxedo, the aggressive posture and the sheer unadulterated entitlement radiating from him. The agent did not reach for his radio. He did not call his supervisor. He did not take a single step backward. Instead, the agent let out a short breath that sounded almost like a chuckle. A slow, grim smile spread across his hardened face. He locked eyes with Julian, holding up the folded stack of federal warrants. The lead agent did not flinch. He did not lower his gaze. He simply unclipped a heavy black pen from his tactical vest and tapped the thick stack of federal warrants against his palm. He looked at Julian with an expression of absolute profound pity that is only reserved for the truly delusional. "Your father is Judge Thomas Davis." The agent said, his voice carrying a calm, authoritative resonance that completely overpowered Julian's frantic shouting. "We are intimately aware of exactly who your father is, Mr. Davis. In fact, my colleagues from the Atlanta field office are currently escorting the honorable judge out of his downtown chambers as we speak." Julian's mouth snapped shut. The defiant, rigid posture he had maintained just seconds prior seemed to instantly liquefy. He stared at the agent, his brain completely unable to process the words he was hearing. The agent took another deliberate step forward, closing the gap and invading Julian's immaculate personal space. He informed Julian that invoking his father's name was the absolute worst tactical error he could have made tonight. The agent explained that the forensic data dumped on the Federal Bureau's desk at 6 o'clock this morning by Vanguard Capital did not just expose a simple domestic embezzlement scheme. It exposed a highly sophisticated international money laundering syndicate. The $4 million you and your wife stole from your employer was just the seed money. The agent continued, his voice echoing relentlessly through the dead quiet ballroom. "You used those funds to aggressively leverage a network of offshore shell companies based in Macau and the Cayman Islands. You routed the illicit capital through accounts directly tied to the Davis Family Trust." I watched Julian's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated horror. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs were visibly shaking. He bumped heavily into the edge of a catering table, sending a silver platter clattering to the floor. "You committed wire fraud across international borders," the agent stated firmly, holding up the warrant for the entire room to see. "You implicated the generational wealth of your entire lineage." Because of the irrefutable digital footprint provided by Vanguard Capital, a federal magistrate signed off on a full Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act investigation 2 hours ago. "We did not just freeze your checking accounts, Julian. The federal government has seized the Davis Family Trust. We have frozen your father's pension, your offshore equity, your real estate portfolios, and every single dime of generational wealth your family has hoarded for the last century. You have absolutely nothing left." The silence that blanketed the Oak Ridge Country Club was heavier than concrete. The wealthy executives, the legacy members, the old money families who had spent the entire evening drinking Julian's champagne and laughing at his jokes all physically recoiled. They took synchronized steps away from the golden couple, treating them like active radioactive waste. In the world of high society and corporate finance, there is no sin greater than losing your capital. Julian was no longer a powerful peer. He was a monumental liability. The total evaporation of Julian's arrogance was a spectacular visceral event to witness. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. He looked down at his own trembling hands as if he did not recognize them. The impenetrable armor of his white corporate privilege, the shield he had so aggressively wielded to destroy my life. 18 months ago, shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. He had built his entire identity on the absolute certainty that his pedigree made him untouchable. He believed that the justice system was a weapon designed exclusively to punish people who looked like me and protect men who looked like him. Now the very system he weaponized was actively consuming him whole. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, wheezing gasp escaped his throat. He looked frantically toward the crowd, searching for any friendly face, any business partner who might step forward and vouch for his character. They all turned their heads away, avoiding eye contact completely. He was entirely alone. The lead agent did not give him another second to strategize. He gave a sharp nod to the two agents standing directly behind Julian. They moved with swift, brutal efficiency. One agent grabbed Julian's right wrist, twisting it firmly behind his back, while the other agent secured his left arm. The crisp, expensive fabric of Julian's tailored tuxedo jacket bunched and tore under the aggressive handling. Julian let out a weak, pathetic whimper of protest as he was shoved roughly against the edge of the glass table. The sharp, metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs, snapping shut around his wrists, echoed through the grand ballroom. It was the exact same sound I had heard in my parents' living room 540 days ago. I remembered the heavy, cold steel biting into my skin while my father watched and did nothing. I remembered Julian standing by the fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon and smiling while the officers read me my rights. Now it was Julian's turn to hear the recitation of his downfall. The agent leaned in close, advising him that he had the right to remain silent and that anything he said would be actively used against him in a federal court of law. Julian's knees buckled. The agents had to physically hoist him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the marble floor. He was completely broken, stripped of his title, his money, and his false dignity in a matter of minutes. Jada watched the entire sequence of events unfold from her position on the floor. She had been crying hysterically just moments before, but the revelation of the frozen generational wealth had shocked her into a state of paralyzed silence. The tears tracking through her expensive foundation stopped completely. I watched her mind frantically calculating the catastrophic reality of her situation. Jada had sacrificed her own sister to a federal prison solely to maintain her proximity to the Davis family money. She had committed fraud, forgery, and perjury just to keep her sprawling suburban mansion, her luxury vehicles, and her front row seat at the country club. Now she realized that the mansion was foreclosed, the cars were repossessed, and the massive trust fund she banked her entire future on was officially property of the federal government. She had absolutely nothing to show for her betrayal. She had burned down her soul for a payout that no longer existed. The two federal agents began marching Julian toward the main exit, dragging him past the horrified stares of the church congregation. Jada did not reach out for her husband. She did not scream his name or profess her undying love, or vow to call a lawyer to save him. The moment Julian's net worth dropped to zero, her loyalty to him evaporated completely. She watched him being hauled away like a discarded piece of trash, her eyes wide and unblinking. Then she slowly turned her head and looked up at me. I was standing tall and immaculate, my tailored suit perfectly composed, looking down at her from a position of absolute, unshakable power. I was the only person in the room who possessed the capital, the influence, and the leverage to change her fate. I was the billionaire owner of the ground she was currently kneeling on. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, completely overriding whatever shredded dignity Jada had left. She let out a desperate, ragged sob and scrambled across the spilled champagne and broken crystal on her hands and knees. She did not care that her silk designer gown was soaking up alcohol and blood from the shattered glass. She did not care that the entire elite society of Atlanta was watching her crawl. Jada reached me and lunged forward, throwing her arms out desperately. She dropped her weight entirely onto her knees right at my feet. Her hands shot out and she grabbed tight handfuls of the dark, expensive fabric at the hem of my designer pants. Her knuckles were white, her grip frantic and painfully tight. She buried her tear-streaked face against my shins, sobbing with a loud, hysterical desperation that echoed above the fading sirens outside. Jada sobbed, her voice cracking as she clung to the hem of my pants. "Please, Imani, I am begging you. You have to tell them this is a mistake. Tell them it is just a misunderstanding between sisters. I did not want to do it, Imani. Julian made me. He told me the men he owed money to were going to kill him. He said they would come after me and the house. I was terrified. I am the victim here." She looked up at me, her face a horrific mess of running mascara and smeared foundation. The perfectly curated country club wife was gone, completely replaced by a frantic, terrified woman willing to say absolutely anything to avoid the consequences of her own actions. She gripped the fabric of my trousers so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She promised she would pay me back every single cent. She swore she would publicly apologize in front of the entire church congregation. She even offered to sign over her house to me, completely forgetting that my company already owned the foreclosure rights. I looked down at her ruined dress. The expensive silk was soaked in spilled champagne and smeared with drops of blood from the broken glass on the marble floor. I felt the physical weight of her desperation pulling at my legs, but I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I remembered a very different Jada. I remembered the Jada who walked into the federal courthouse 18 months ago. "You wore a pristine white Chanel dress to my sentencing hearing." "Jada," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that cut right through her hysterical sobbing. I spoke slowly, enunciating every single word so it would burn itself into her memory. "I remember exactly how you looked that day. Your hair was perfectly styled. You wore those diamond earrings Julian bought you with the money you both stole from my reputation. You sat right in the front row of the gallery, sitting next to Mom and Dad." Jada shook her head frantically, trying to interrupt me, trying to beg again, but I did not stop. When the judge slammed his gavel down and sentenced me to a federal prison facility, I turned around to look at my family. I continued, my tone devoid of all warmth. "I was terrified. I was crying. I looked at you hoping to see just a fraction of remorse or guilt. But you were smiling. You leaned over the wooden railing of the gallery dividing us. You looked me right in the eye while the bailiff was putting the handcuffs on my wrists, and you whispered that I got exactly what I deserved." Jada gasped, her mouth falling open, as the memory of her own cruelty was thrown directly back in her face. The frantic pleading died in her throat. She realized in that exact second that there was absolutely no manipulation tactic left in her arsenal that could save her. She had spent her entire life using my empathy against me, but she had finally bled that well completely dry. I took a deliberate step backward. I gently but firmly pulled my leg away from her grasping hands. The expensive dark fabric of my suit slipped through her fingers, leaving her grasping at empty air. "You told me I got what I deserved," I said, my voice carrying a profound, chilling finality. "Now you are getting yours." The female federal agent, who had been standing patiently a few feet away, stepped forward immediately. She did not handle Jada with the gentle reverence the country club staff usually afforded the golden child. The agent grabbed Jada firmly by the upper arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. Jada stumbled, her high heels slipping wildly on the wet marble floor. She let out a sharp cry of protest, instinctively trying to jerk her arms away from the agent. It was the worst possible reaction. The agent spun Jada around with brutal, practiced efficiency, pinning her arms securely behind her back. The sharp, metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the exact same sound I had heard in my own living room a year and a half ago. Jada let out a piercing, guttural scream. The reality of the cold steel binding her wrists finally shattered her denial completely. She twisted her neck, looking frantically toward the center of the room where our parents stood paralyzed. "Mom, Dad," she shrieked, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the room. "Do something. Call my lawyer. Do not let them take me. You have to stop them. Please, Mom, help me." Yvonne took a single trembling step forward, her hands reaching out uselessly toward her golden child. But she stopped dead in her tracks when a second federal agent put a hand on his tactical belt and gave her a stern, warning glare. Yvonne had spent her entire life manipulating church committees and intimidating retail workers, but she was absolutely powerless against the federal government. All of her social maneuvering, all of her carefully constructed neighborhood alliances meant absolutely nothing in the face of a federal racketeering warrant. Calvin stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had built his entire identity on the illusion of his successful, flawless family could not do a single thing to save his favorite daughter. He had zero capital zero influence and zero authority here. He was just an old man in a rumpled suit watching his legacy burn to ashes. The agents marched Jada toward the double oak doors. She dragged her feet, crying hysterically, calling out to the wealthy executives and church elders who were actively turning their backs on her. The people she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress were now holding up their smartphones, recording her humiliating exit to share on their group chats. The golden child of the Davis family, the pride of the congregation, was paraded out of the grand ballroom like a common thief. The heavy doors swung shut behind the agents, cutting off Jada's frantic screaming. The silence that rushed back into the ballroom was suffocating. The flashing red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles outside continued to bathe the room in an erratic neon glow, but the immediate chaos had ended. The raid was over. The criminals were gone. The remaining guests began to quietly shuffle toward the exits, eager to escape the suffocating tension and distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Davis family implosion. Nobody wanted to be the last one standing in a room owned by the woman they had all just been gossiping about. In the center of the ruined ballroom, standing amidst the shattered crystal, the trampled white orchids, and the spilled vintage champagne, Calvin and Yvonne were left completely alone. Their massive suburban mansion was foreclosed. Their wealthy white son-in-law was in federal custody. Their perfect golden child was facing years in a federal penitentiary. The generational wealth they had sacrificed me to secure was permanently frozen by the government. They had absolutely nothing left to their names. Slowly, they both turned their heads. They looked away from the doors where Jada had vanished, and they looked directly at me. I stood tall and immaculate, my posture perfect, my face a mask of absolute, unshakable power. I was the only person left in their ruined world who possessed any actual capital. I was a billionaire private equity founder. I owned the very floor they were standing on. I was their only remaining truly successful child. I watched the realization wash over their faces. The sheer terror and devastation in their eyes morphed into something entirely different. It was a sickening, desperate pivot. The same parents who had called me a bitter, jealous ex-convict just 30 minutes ago suddenly looked at me with a profound, desperate affection. Their eyes softened, attempting to project a maternal and paternal warmth that made my stomach physically churn. They were looking at me not as a daughter they had wronged, but as their absolute last remaining lifeline. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the fate of the golden child. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles outside painted chaotic shadows across the vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom. The absolute silence left in the wake of the federal raid was heavy enough to crush bone. The elite guests had completely scattered, leaving nothing behind but overturned chairs, abandoned designer coats, and shattered crystal. In the exact center of this opulent devastation stood Calvin and Yvonne, my parents, the pillars of our local church community, the couple who had spent the last decade curating a flawless image of Black excellence, built entirely on the fragile foundation of a white son-in-law and a stolen corporate fortune. Now they were completely alone. Their suburban kingdom was foreclosed, their generational wealth was frozen, and their favorite daughter was sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle facing years of hard time. I watched them slowly turn their heads away from the doors and look directly at me. I was the only person left in their ruined world who held any actual power. I was a billionaire private equity founder. I owned the very floor they were standing on. I was their only remaining truly successful child. The sheer terror and devastation in their eyes morphed into something entirely different in a matter of seconds. It was a sickening, desperate pivot. The same parents who had called me a bitter, jealous ex-convict just an hour ago suddenly looked at me with a profound, desperate affection. Their eyes softened, attempting to project a maternal and paternal warmth that made my stomach physically churn. They were looking at me not as a daughter they had profoundly wronged, but as their absolute last remaining financial lifeline. Calvin took a hesitant step forward, his polished shoes crunching over the broken glass. His rigid, authoritative posture completely dissolved. He slouched his shoulders, dropping the intimidating patriarch persona he had wielded like a weapon my entire life. He held both of his hands out toward me, palms open in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Imani, he began, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his sudden vulnerability. Imani, baby, please listen to me. I took another step, closing the distance, trying to wrap his arms around my shoulders for an embrace. I did not step back. I simply raised my right hand, holding my palm flat in the air between us. It was a physical barrier that stopped him dead in his tracks. He froze, his arms hovering awkwardly in the empty space between us. We can fix this, Calvin stammered, tears welling up in his bloodshot eyes. We can rebuild this family. Julian deceived us, Imani. He manipulated all of us. He spun a web of lies, and we were just too blind to see the truth. We had no idea the depths of his financial crimes. We did not know he was the one pulling the strings behind the embezzlement. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his trembling jaw. He looked around the ballroom, gesturing to the lavish surroundings that I now owned. But look at what you have accomplished. Calvin continued, his tone shifting into a frantic, sycophantic praise. Vanguard Capital. You built a financial empire from the ground up. You are brilliant, Imani. You have always possessed a brilliant mind and an incredible work ethic. Your mother and I are so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. We can put all of this ugliness behind us. We can start fresh, just the three of us. You belong with us. We are your family. I stared at the sweat dripping down my father's chin. I looked at the man who had marched into this ballroom, threatening to call 911 to have me dragged out in handcuffs. I looked at the man who had stepped over my crying body 18 months ago to protect Julian's pristine corporate reputation. You are not proud of me, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal calm that echoed clearly across the empty marble floor. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you suddenly recognize my worth. Calvin flinched as if I had physically struck him, but I did not stop. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. You are just out of options. I continued, speaking slowly and deliberately, so every single word carved itself into his conscience. You are looking at the ashes of your social standing, and you are desperately trying to tether your sinking ship to my yacht. You do not love me. You love my capital. You love that I own this country club. You love that I have the power to potentially save your reputation in the church. But you sold me out to a federal prison cell to protect a suburban facade that never even existed. Yvonne let out a loud, ragged sob. She pushed past Calvin, her face a ruined mask of running makeup and sheer desperation. She grabbed her own chest, clutching the expensive silk of her evening gown, as if her heart were physically failing. How can you be so cold, Imani? Yvonne wailed, her voice pitching high and frantic. I am your mother. I carried you in my womb. I gave you life. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood when we are in our darkest hour. The Lord commands us to forgive. You have to show us grace. I looked at my mother, completely unbothered by her religious guilt trip. She had weaponized the church against me my entire life, using scripture to demand my obedience while offering me absolutely zero protection in return. Grace. I repeated the word, tasting bitter and foul on my tongue. You want grace, Mom. Where was your grace when I begged you to hire a lawyer for me? Where was your maternal instinct when you sat in the front row of the courtroom and watched the judge sentence me to 540 days in a concrete box? You did not pray for me then. You went to a wine tasting in Napa Valley to celebrate your golden child's anniversary. You sacrificed my freedom on the altar of your social climbing ambitions. Yvonne shook her head violently, refusing to accept accountability. We thought you were guilty, she sobbed, trying to grab my hand. The evidence Julian presented was so convincing. We were just trying to protect the family name from the scandal. You protected the white man who was draining your bank accounts while you threw your own black daughter to the justice system. I fired back, shutting down her pathetic excuses instantly. You made your choice. You chose the illusion of proximity to wealth over the reality of my innocence. And now the illusion is dead. Calvin and Yvonne stood before me, completely stripped of their pride, their status, and their toxic authority. They had spent 3 decades demanding my submission and punishing my independence. Now they were completely at my mercy, and they knew with terrifying certainty that I had none left to give. I reached into the inner compartment of my designer bag. My fingers brushed against the smooth, heavy cardstock of a sealed legal document. I had prepared this specific envelope weeks ago, anticipating this exact moment of reckoning. I pulled the thick envelope out into the open. The stark white paper contrasted sharply against my midnight black suit. I held it out, extending my arm directly toward my mother. Yvonne stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked from the envelope to my face, searching my unreadable expression for any sign of forgiveness or salvation. She found absolutely nothing but cold, calculated finality. Slowly, she raised her hands. Her fingers were trembling so violently she could barely grasp the thick paper. She took the envelope from my hand, the heavy seal breaking with a sharp, crisp snap that echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Yvonne pulled the thick stack of documents from the envelope with trembling fingers. The heavy legal paper rustled loudly in the dead quiet of the grand ballroom. At the very top of the first page, the bold black crest of Vanguard Capital was stamped with undeniable authority. But it was not the logo of my private equity firm that made the blood completely drain from her face. It was the specific address typed in stark capitalized letters right beneath the header. It was the address of the sprawling 6-bedroom colonial house, sitting on 2 acres of pristine manicured property in the most exclusive subdivision in the county. It was the house they had owned for 20 years, the house that served as the ultimate physical monument to their social climbing and their obsession with respectability politics. Calvin stepped up directly behind her, his breathing ragged and shallow. He leaned over her shaking shoulders to read the documents. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the dense legal paragraphs. He was a man who prided himself on his intelligence, but right now he looked like he was trying to decipher a foreign language. He read the bold red text positioned at the center of the page. Notice of foreclosure and imminent eviction. Calvin snatched the papers out of Yvonne's hands, his eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated horror as he flipped to the second page. He saw the financial schedules, the default notices, and the original loan origination signatures. He saw his own signature right next to Yvonne's, and directly beneath the looping, arrogant signature of his white knight son-in-law. "What is this?" Calvin choked out his voice, barely a terrified whisper. He looked up at me, his face contorted in total disbelief. "Imani, what does this mean? We own our home. We paid off the primary mortgage 5 years ago. You know we did. You paid off the primary mortgage using the money. I quietly transferred to your accounts before you threw me to the wolves," I corrected him, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of sympathy. "But you did not own that house free and clear, Dad. You just thought you did because you trusted a man who saw your desperation for status as a weapon he could use against you." I took a slow, measured step forward, forcing Calvin to maintain eye contact. I broke down the financial reality for him piece by painful piece, so he could fully understand the magnitude of his own foolishness. 14 months ago, Julian was drowning, I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional, as if I were conducting a boardroom autopsy. The internal auditors at his logistics firm were digging deeper into the missing $4 million. My conviction bought him time, but it did not solve his underlying liquidity crisis. His offshore bookies were threatening his life over his massive gambling debts. He needed a massive injection of clean, untraceable cash to stay afloat and keep his corporate masters completely in the dark. But Julian could not secure a traditional loan because his personal credit was secretly in ruins. Yvonne shook her head violently, refusing to comprehend the trap she had walked right into. "He said it was a bridge loan," she cried out, her voice pitching high and frantic. "Julian told us he had a temporary cash flow issue because his funds were tied up in a massive real estate development in Dubai. He said he just needed us to co-sign a temporary commercial loan to float his company for 90 days. He promised us a 20% return on our investment. He swore on his life that our house would never actually be at risk." "And you believed him?" I said, a harsh, bitter laugh escaping my lips. You believed him because he wore an expensive suit and spoke with the unearned confidence of a wealthy white executive. You were so blinded by your desperation to maintain your proximity to his generational wealth that you literally signed away the deed to your own sanctuary. You leveraged the only tangible asset you had left to protect a man who had just finished destroying your youngest daughter. Calvin looked down at the documents, his hands shaking so violently the papers rattled. He saw the chain of custody detailed on the third page. He saw how the original predatory lender had sold the distressed debt to a secondary holding company. And then he saw the final line of the transfer agreement. He saw the exact date that Vanguard Capital had swooped in and acquired the entire portfolio of Julian's defaulted commercial loans. "Yao bought the debt!" Calvin whispered, the horrific realization finally crashing down upon him. "You bought the lien on our home." "I did not just buy the debt, Dad," I replied, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "I bought your entire reality." When Julian defaulted on the payments 6 months ago, the original lenders panicked. They packaged his toxic loans and sold them at a massive discount in a closed-door commercial auction. My acquisition team at Vanguard Capital monitors distressed assets attached to corporate executives facing potential fraud investigations. We acquired the portfolio for pennies on the dollar. I have owned the deed to your perfect suburban fortress for the last 30 days. I just waited for the absolute perfect moment to serve the eviction notice. Yvonne staggered backward, clutching her chest as if she were suffering a massive heart attack. She bumped into a catering table, sending a stack of abandoned china plates crashing to the marble floor. She did not even look at the mess. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that her entire social universe was about to be completely obliterated. "You cannot do this!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "We are respected members of the community Imani. We host the church auxiliary meetings in that house every single month. We host the pastor's anniversary banquet in our backyard. Our friends, our neighbors, the entire congregation looks up to us." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely no pity for the panic tearing her apart. Her entire life was a performance dedicated to managing the perceptions of other people. She cared more about what the women on the usher board thought of her living room decor than she cared about my survival in a federal prison. "That is exactly why this is so poetic, Mom," I told her, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal satisfaction. "You have spent your entire life weaponizing church optics. You used your status in the congregation to justify discarding me. You stood in the church lobby every Sunday for the last 18 months and told everyone who asked that I had lost my way, that I had fallen into sin, that you were praying for my soul, while you secretly knew I was entirely innocent. You played the role of the tragic, heartbroken mother perfectly, while you hosted lavish dinner parties funded by Julian's stolen money. I took another step closer, invading her personal space, just like the federal agents had invaded her golden child's anniversary gala. "I want you to picture exactly what is going to happen this coming Monday morning," I said, painting the picture with deliberate, cruel precision. "At exactly 8 o'clock, the county sheriff's department is going to pull up to your pristine driveway. They are going to be driving marked vehicles, with their lights flashing for the entire neighborhood to see. The bank-appointed contractors are going to walk right up to your custom mahogany front door, and they are going to drill out the locks. They are going to haul your expensive leather sofas, your antique dining table, and all of those beautiful family portraits that you specifically excluded me from, and they are going to dump them right onto your perfectly manicured front lawn." Calvin let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He covered his mouth with his hand, trying to suppress the physical wave of nausea washing over him. "Think about the timing, Mom." I continued, relentlessly ignoring my father's breakdown. "Monday morning is when Sister Jenkins and the rest of the neighborhood watch committee take their daily power walk through the subdivision. They are going to walk right past your house. They are going to see the foreclosure signs pounded into the grass. They are going to see your entire life boxed up in cheap cardboard sitting on the curb. By noon, the group chats will be on fire. By Tuesday evening, the entire church will know that Deacon Calvin and Sister Yvonne are completely bankrupt and homeless because they enabled a federal criminal. You are going to have a whole lot of explaining to do at Sunday service next week." I added, a dark, humored smile touching the corners of my mouth. I wonder what Bible verse you are going to use to justify losing your house to a white-collar fraud investigation. Yvonne could not take it anymore. The terrifying vision of her absolute public humiliation broke the last remaining pillar of her sanity. The woman who had proudly commanded church committees and terrorized retail workers completely shattered. She dropped heavily to her knees on the cold marble floor, the expensive silk of her designer dress soaking up the spilled champagne and broken crystal left behind by her arrested daughter. She threw her head back and wailed. It was a loud, agonizing sound that held no dignity and no restraint. She wept with the raw, unfiltered panic of someone watching their entire existence burn to ashes. She crawled forward, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the fabric of my custom-tailored pants, just like Jada had done minutes before. Imani, please, Yvonne sobbed hysterically, tears and mascara running freely down her cheeks. Please do not do this to us. We are old, Imani. We have health problems. Your father's heart cannot take this kind of stress. We cannot start over from nothing. We have nowhere to go. We have no savings left. You cannot put us out on the street. We are your own flesh and blood. You came from my body. You cannot be this cruel to your own mother. I looked down at the woman begging at my feet. I studied her tear-stained face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse for the hell she had put me through. I found nothing but the selfish primal terror of a woman losing her status. She was not crying because she had betrayed me. She was crying because she had finally been caught, and the punishment was going to be public. I reached down and gently, but with absolute unyielding force, pulled her hands off my clothes. I stepped back, putting physical distance between my success and her ruin. Do not ever talk to me about flesh and blood. I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch that instantly silenced her wailing. Where was that flesh and blood argument when I was shivering on a thin plastic mattress in the middle of winter? Where was your maternal instinct when the prison guards locked me in solitary confinement for 3 days because I refused to back down from a violent inmate who tried to steal my food? You were sleeping soundly in your custom king-sized bed in that beautiful house while I was fighting to keep my sanity in a cage. You did not shed a single tear for my suffering. You only care about blood when your own neck is on the chopping block. Calvin fell to his knees right beside his weeping wife. He did not try to reach for me. He just bowed his head, staring at the broken glass on the floor, completely defeated. He knew there was absolutely no logical argument he could make. He knew he had traded his integrity for proximity to Julian's wealth, and the bill had finally come due. We deserve this, Calvin whispered, his voice thick with shame and total resignation. We sold our souls to protect Jada, and we lost everything anyway. We have nothing left to offer you, Imani. We are completely at your mercy. I looked at my parents kneeling together in the wreckage of the grand ballroom. The flashing emergency lights from outside cast long, erratic shadows across their broken figures. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, making me feel like an outsider in my own home, punishing my independence and sacrificing me to maintain their illusions. Now they were entirely broken, stripped of their money, their reputation, and their golden child. They expected me to revel in their complete destruction. They expected me to leave them kneeling on the floor and walk out the door, letting them face the brutal reality of homelessness, without a single lifeline. They knew they had earned exactly that level of cold-blooded vengeance. I watched them cry, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure washing over my spirit. The anger that had fueled my survival in prison, the burning rage that had driven me to build Vanguard Capital into a ruthless financial empire, it all slowly began to evaporate. I did not need to scream anymore. I did not need to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I had won the war entirely on my own terms. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile air of the ballroom fill my lungs. I looked down at my parents for the very last time. I reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers closed around one final small item. It was not a weapon. It was not another foreclosure notice or a legal threat. I pulled my hand out into the open, holding the small object tightly in my palm. I looked down at my parents kneeling on the cold marble floor. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles outside cast long, shifting shadows across their tear-stained faces. My expression remains completely blank. I feel no anger anymore. I feel no sadness. The hollow ache that used to live in my chest, the one that constantly begged for their approval, has been entirely carved out and replaced with solid steel. I reach into the interior pocket of my custom-tailored suit jacket. My fingers brush against the smooth, heavy paper of one final envelope. I pull it out, holding it between us. The stark white paper is the only clean thing left in this ruined ballroom. I look at Yvonne. Her makeup is completely destroyed, running in dark, jagged lines down her cheeks. I look at Calvin. His proud shoulders are slumped, his breathing shallow and rapid. I hold the envelope out and let it drop. It lands on the glass coffee table with a soft thud. I tell them I am not a monster. I tell them that, unlike them, I do not leave my blood to rot in the cold. Inside that envelope are the keys to a modest one-bedroom apartment located on the south side of the city. I explain that the lease is fully prepaid for exactly 6 months. The utilities are turned on. The refrigerator is stocked. It is a clean, safe place for two people who have just lost absolutely everything to sleep tonight. But I make it crystal clear that this is where my charity permanently ends. I tell them that after those 6 months expire, they are entirely on their own. They will have to find jobs. They will have to ride the bus. They will have to figure out how to survive in the real world without a golden child to parade around and without a scapegoat to bleed dry. I look at them and I say the words I have waited 10 years to say. Consider my black tax paid in full. I explain how I spent my entire adult life carrying the financial weight of their bad decisions. I paid their mortgages. I funded their church-building campaigns. I bought their luxury vehicles. I was the safety net they abused and took for granted. The black tax is the unspoken rule that the successful child must carry the entire family on her back, but they twisted that cultural expectation into a weapon of extortion. They took my money while giving their love and praise exclusively to Jada. They demanded my financial submission while treating me like an outcast. Now the ledger is completely balanced. The debt is settled forever. There will be no more wire transfers. There will be no more emergency bailouts. The Bank of Imani is permanently and irrevocably closed. Yvonne lets out a guttural, devastating wail. She reaches forward, her shaking hands hovering over the white envelope. She cries out that they are too old to start over. She begs me not to do this to my own flesh and blood. She tells me that the south side of the city is not safe for them, that they cannot possibly live in a one-bedroom apartment after spending 2 decades in a sprawling suburban estate. Her tears fall onto the glass table, but they do not move me. Calvin simply stares at the keys resting inside the open flap of the envelope, his spirit completely broken. He knows there is no negotiation left. He knows that if they do not take those keys, they will be sleeping on the street by Monday morning. I do not offer another word of comfort. I simply turn my back on them. I pivot on my heels, turning away from my weeping parents and the shattered remnants of the Davis family anniversary gala. I face the grand exit of the ballroom. The federal agents are still stationed by the doors, securing the perimeter, while the last of the local police cruisers idle in the driveway. The flashing red and blue lights continue to pulse through the massive windows, creating a surreal disco effect over the ruined party. I begin to walk. My strides are even measured and completely unbothered. The heavy silence in the room is broken only by the sharp, confident clicking of my heels against the marble floor. I walk toward the sea of wealthy guests, the country club elite, the church deacons, and the corporate investors who have been standing perfectly still watching the entire spectacle unfold. As I approach, the crowd begins to move. They do not whisper, they do not point, they simply part. The sea of expensive gowns and tailored tuxedos splits right down the middle, creating a wide, clear path for me to walk through. I look at their faces as I pass. I see the church elders who used to gossip about my prison sentence now lowering their eyes in absolute shame and fear. I see the choir director who once told my mother I was a lost cause now staring at me in stunned silence. I see the wealthy wives who used to play tennis with Jada now looking at me with a profound, terrified respect. They know they are standing in a building that I own. They know I possess the power to buy their husbands' companies and liquidate their assets before breakfast. I am no longer the disgraced daughter of Calvin and Yvonne. I am the apex predator of their financial ecosystem. I do not smile at them. I do not acknowledge their presence. I walk through the parted crowd like a queen inspecting her newly conquered territory. My two massive security guards fall into step right behind me, their presence a silent reminder of my absolute authority. We pass the grand chandelier. We pass the shattered champagne flutes. We pass the final row of terrified socialites. I reach the heavy double oak doors, the same doors I kicked open just an hour ago. I push the doors open and step out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night. The air outside is incredibly fresh. It smells of pine needles, damp earth, and absolute freedom. It is a stark contrast to the suffocating, stagnant air inside the ballroom. The valet parking area is a scene of organized chaos. The federal vehicles are blocking the main driveway, their radios squawking with harsh static. The tow truck has already disappeared into the night, taking Julian's prized sports car with it. I walk down the pristine marble steps of the country club. I look up at the massive white columns and the sprawling architecture of the estate that now belongs entirely to Vanguard Capital. I bought this place not because I wanted to play golf, but because I wanted to own the very ground my enemies stood on. Now it is simply another asset in my portfolio. At the base of the steps, my private vehicle is waiting. It is a sleek midnight black Maybach, its polished surface reflecting the flashing emergency lights. My personal driver, a quiet professional man, stands at attention by the rear passenger door. As I approach, he gives a sharp, respectful nod and pulls the heavy armored door open for me. I step into the back of the Maybach. The interior smells of rich custom leather and quiet wealth. I slide into the plush reclining seat, letting my body sink into the unmatched comfort. The driver closes the heavy door with a solid, comforting thud. The moment the door seals shut, the chaotic noise of the outside world is instantly extinguished. The screaming sirens, the crying parents, the whispering crowds, they are all completely silenced. The soundproofing of the vehicle wraps around me like a protective cocoon. I reach out and pour myself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled crystal decanter in the center console. I take a slow, refreshing sip. The driver smoothly shifts the vehicle into gear, and we pull away from the Oak Ridge Country Club. We glide silently past the federal agents, past the barricades, and out onto the main highway. I press a button on the armrest, and the privacy partition softly rolls up, separating me from the driver. I turn my head and look out the dark tinted window. The glittering, sprawling skyline of Atlanta rises up in the distance. The skyscrapers pierce the night sky, their glowing windows representing thousands of businesses, billions of dollars, and endless opportunities. I look at the city, and I think about the last 540 days. I think about the tiny concrete cell, the thin, uncomfortable mattress, the terrible food, and the constant suffocating fear. I think about the days I spent staring at a cinder block wall, wondering if my family ever thought about me. I think about the sheer agonizing pain of realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me were the ones who built my cage. But the pain is completely gone now. The fire that burned in my chest for 18 months has consumed all the weakness, all the doubt, and all the desperate longing for my parents' approval. I am no longer the victim of their toxic narrative. I am the architect of my own absolute victory. I took the trauma they inflicted on me, and I forged it into a financial weapon, so devastating they will never recover from the blast radius. Jada will spend the best years of her life wearing the same orange jumpsuit she laughed at me for wearing. Julian will watch his generational wealth be dismantled and auctioned off by the federal government. Calvin and Yvonne will wake up in a cramped, cheap apartment, realizing they traded a billionaire daughter for a criminal son-in-law and a foreclosed mansion. They built their entire lives on a fragile illusion of superiority, and I am the one who finally brought the hammer down on the glass. The Maybach glides seamlessly onto the interstate, heading toward my penthouse in the city. The glowing lights of the Atlanta skyline reflect in the dark tinted glass, overlaying my own reflection. I look at the woman in the window. She is strong, she is wealthy, she is completely untouchable. I take a deep, calming breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, unburdened air of total liberation. A slow, genuine smile finally spreads across my face, reaching all the way to my eyes. They took 18 months of my life, so I took the rest of theirs. And it was the sweetest deal I ever closed. The hardest truth to accept in life is that sharing biology does not automatically make someone family. For years, we are conditioned to believe that blood requires endless sacrifice, that we must endure manipulation, betrayal, and financial drain simply to honor the people who raised us. But loyalty should never be a one-way street that leads directly to your own destruction. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose their social status and their pride over your freedom, they forfeit the right to claim you as their own. True power does not come from screaming your innocence to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. It comes from silent strategy and an unbreakable belief in your own worth. When you hit rock bottom and find yourself completely abandoned, do not waste your energy begging for a seat at a table where you are not respected. Use that isolated time to build your own empire instead. Success born from pure survival is the absolute most devastating response you can ever deliver to those who tried to bury you. Walking away from toxic family dynamics and breaking the cycle of the black tax is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of radical self-preservation. You are allowed to cut ties with people who only value you for the financial or social capital they can extract from your suffering. You do not owe anyone your future just because they happen to share your past. Forgiveness does not mean granting continued access to your life, and firm boundaries are the strongest armor you can wear. True liberation happens the exact moment you realize your worth is not defined by their validation. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and build your own success? Share your personal journey in the comments below to help others find the courage to do the exact same thing. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about resilience, justice, and reclaiming your life.